The bizarre job offer at Candle Cove sounded like easy money. I always know when trouble smells different from the usual, like old diesel and wet rope. But that night the trouble smelled like something else. Copper sweetened with the ocean's mouth. I tell you that up front because it's the kind of detail you keep when you're trying to remember what went wrong. Small things anchor you. They let you go back through the knot of it and not get lost in what you think you felt. My name's George Calder. I've been hauling nets and towing long lines since I was barely tall enough to see over the rail. The sea's my ledger, weather in one column, the weight of the catch in another. Best I can do is balance those books and hope the tide treats you fair. I wasn't looking for trouble when I drifted into Redstone Isle. I had a wrecked boat, a borrowed jacket, and debt sitting like a barnacle on my ribs. There's a way a place greets you before it ever speaks. The ferry spit me off at the little landing between Big Red and Little Red, the two halves of the island that never bothered to be whole. The houses lean into each other like old men swapping a blanket. The air there tastes of salt and smoke. Even the gulls seem to move around some invisible thing the way folks avoid a certain bench at the bar. I should have turned around. Most men would have, but I needed a hole under my feet and a chance to pay what I owed. Charles Rupert met me by the slip before sundown. He's the sort of man who wears civility like a coat, buttoned up all the time. Polite hands, careful eyes. He'd been elected mayor of Big Red 2 winters ago and manages the town the way you manage a stubborn engine. A little force, a lot of tinkering. "You look like you can handle a skiff," he said, and smiled like he knew the answer was yes. He handed me the keys to something that smelled of tar and old rope. The boat had seen better weather. Its motor coughed like an old dog. Charles ran his thumb over the hull like he was marking territory. "There's a debt," he told me. "You don't need to pay up front. We'll work it off. There's a job. Someone needs something taken from near Candle Cove. Pays good. 1 night, 1 catch. You clear the ledger quick." He said Candle Cove like it was a proper noun and a warning all at once. The word hung like a bell. I asked him questions. Where exactly? Who's asking? What's the catch? And he gave me what he always gives, precise vagueness. "Near Candle Cove," he repeated. "Night work. Simon at the market will take it. Pays better than usual. You've done this before. You'll manage." That was the job offer. That was the beginning. It was simple and dirty and the kind of thing that stretches a man's conscience when the tally book is red and you owe more mouths than you have nets. Before I go further, stick with me if you like strange sea stories. This one doesn't end neat, but if you've ever had to decide between feeding your family and feeding your curiosity, you'll feel where I was standing. The boat Charles gave me was a patched thing, painted in a color that had once been white, now gone to whalebone. The dockmaster, a thin man named Peter, met me at the cleat and climbed aboard with a flashlight that flickered like it was nervous. "You'll have to mind her," Peter said, tapping a spot along the planked floor. "Left it there in a hurry." When I peeled up the board where he tapped, there was a scrap of paper folded small and tucked beneath a splintering nail. It was a fragment of a chart, the sort seaman mark with a charcoal stick, line work and a jagged shore. The scrap didn't fit the rest of the chart Peter handed me. The dockmaster shrugged and handed over the map he had, its edges soft with use. "Lost piece," he said. "Someone thought it best I didn't have it. You'll find the roots a little out." The map Peter gave me had a blank where my scrap would have fit, a missing corner with a jagged bay that matched the scrap. Whoever put that scrap under the deck wanted it hidden from eyes that might be prying at the station's ledger. I didn't know yet whether that meant protection or a warning. The first night I took that job, I learned 3 things I didn't want to know. The town keeps ledgers in places it thinks you won't look. The sea will trade you wonders if you shove enough rope and patience at it. And whoever leaves a note on your hull can be trusted to be dangerous if you ignore them. The note was taped to the starboard, black tape over a scrap of paper. I found it when I went out to stow the lantern. The handwriting was neat, simple, and single-lined, like someone who doesn't want to waste ink. "Don't fish here after dark. M." You hold those words and you judge the letter by what it leaves out. It didn't say why, who M was, or what would happen. It left room for your head to fill in the rest. In Redstone Isle, we had room to be creative with the way we imagined danger. We had to be, otherwise we'd all have gone mad. The first few days I learned the rhythms of the town. Julian at the bar knew how to pour a drink without talking too much. He's a lean man, recent cigar-lined, who's been listening to other men's sins for years and has the patience for nothing longer than a short story. He watched me like a thermometer reads for fever, quiet until curiosity outweighed the need for silence. "Don't be asking too many questions," Julian told me the night I walked into his place. The bar smelled of old beer and lemon polish. "Questions make folks remember things they'd rather forget." "I'm not asking for gossip," I said. "Just the facts. How's the market been? Is Simon right about paying premium for odd stuff?" Julian looked at me, then looked away. "Everyone pays what they have to," he said. "Simon doesn't ask where the fish came from when it glows. He pays for what he can sell. Simon, the market's fishmonger, is a man with hands like split kelp. He knows weight and price like a preacher knows scripture. He's not one for small talk. He looks at the catch the way other folks look at a clock. And his ledger proves it. On my second night, after I'd handed off my first catch to his crate, I saw him hold something in his palm like it was a coin and not a living thing. He told me to leave it on the table and come back after dawn. When he opened the crate the next morning, he paid me in bills the way a bank pays out savings. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The first aberration, if I'm to put a name to it, found my line at 2 a.m, when the fog sits like a blanket over the water and your own breath sounds like a stranger. I'd been expecting squid. Squid are practical things, pulpy, clever, and valuable when you know where to sell them. This was not squid as I know it. The line tightened like a fist, but the pull came from below and there was a weight that felt wrong. It wasn't a straightforward jerking like a fish making one last sprint. It was as if something had wrapped itself around the rope and was thinking about what to do next. My lantern leaned and painted the little surface with a dull yellow. I wound the winch, slow, a man's throat tight, heart working under his ribs like a ship's pump. When it came up, the first thing that hit me was the light. It wasn't natural white or blue. It was that green that glows in the dark places. The kind of glow you see when something bioluminescent wants to be noticed. But it wasn't a soft glow, and it didn't belong. The creature pulsed like a lantern gone mad, and from one aperture there oozed a black tar-like film that fell into the bucket and sank. I put my hands on it because that's what you do. You check, you measure, you know if something's salvageable. It was cold in a way that made my fingers ache. Not just sea cold, but like something that's been kept far from warmth. Its skin slid like wet silk. The body was squid-like, but wrong in proportion. Arms too long, coiling like old rope and ending in too many blunt points. Beneath the light that poured from inside it, there was a small, bright core, like a piece of coal lit green. We traded on strange things in Redstone Isle. I'd heard about fish with extra eyes, crabs with mottled shells that shimmered. Simon buys what others won't, and more hands here take what they can. The payment he handed me for that first catch felt like theft and blessing all at once. He wrapped the money tight in brown paper and didn't look me in the face. "You sold this to a man in a dark coat," Simon said when I pressed for a name, not lifting his gaze from the crate. "He comes at odd hours. No one asks questions who wants to keep warm." That's how the island worked. People who needed money would find ways to get it. People who were curious would pry, and some folks would simply disappear into the ledger of the sea. It's practical to close your mouth. But I'm not a man without curiosity. Debt makes you practical. Curiosity makes you stupid. I tucked the scrap of map and the note into my jacket and tried to sleep. The boat listed gently at the dock like it had secrets of its own. I could hear other ships breathing in the moonlight. I could hear Rowan's name whispered in corners like a curse. Rowan had been the mayor before Charles. Older, the kind who kept a small book in his pocket and handled things with an almost nervous precision. They say Rowan found a book, a red and silver thing that didn't belong to any paper on this earth. After that he changed. He kept to himself, drank less, and once he started speaking to the fog as if it were a neighbor, people began to edge away from him. He told tales late at night of shapes in the water that weren't fish. Then one morning he was simply gone. His house was empty and the book was missing. Some say he left. Some say he went down to Candle Cove and stayed. No one's seen him since. I asked Julian about Rowan, careful to make it sound like curiosity and not accusation. Julian sighed, and the sound seemed to carry the weight of the bar into the street. Rowan wasn't the sort to leave, Julian said. He wasn't the sort who forgot to lock his door. Something got under his skin. He started scribbling things in that book and said the fog spoke back. He grew thin. Then one night the fog hung thick between Little Red and Big. He took his boat out. And he didn't come back. The town looked. The dogs knew the places where he used to stand, but we never found him. We found the book, messed through it like thieves, half of us hoping for an explanation, half of us hoping for proof we'd been fools to gossip. The book? Well, it burned, or it disappeared, or it was sold. Stories shift. People do what they must. Julian's face tightened at the memory. When folks talk about Rowan, their voices get narrower, sucked in like breath through a small hole. It feels rude to pry, but I pried anyway. You do when the wind pins you between not knowing and needing to. There was something else at the bar that night, something thicker than memory. The fog had begun its slow march even before night fell. It spilled over the pier, and street lamps became soft moons. Men moved through it with backs bent and heads down. You could see the settlement close its lips in a way only a place that's kept secrets can. After my first aberration, the town's routines bent around me. People offered me small practicalities, a kettle to reheat, a blanket, a place to sleep in the back room of Julian's bar. They offered those things, as if giving them to a man who'd been to sea and come back with something he didn't know how to keep. Conversation slipped past the main point, and I could feel, in the undercurrent, the ledger entries changing hands as people decided whether to treat me like a merchant or a danger. You got a scrap from under that floor. Peter, the dockmaster, told me once when we carried gear, "Don't tell everyone. Some things are for your eyes, because they belong to you now. Other things are best kept away." "What's it mean?" I asked him. He spat over the side like a man getting rid of a bad taste. "Maps. Maps lie. They hide more than they show. Candle Cove is a place that likes being missed." He shrugged like the answer was both a proverb and a warning. The torn map I found fit into the route like a key. It completed the curve of coast that led to the small inlet labeled on no chart I'd ever seen. Candle Cove itself was marked there with a tiny ink dot and a symbol that looked almost like a smile. Seeing it on paper was different than saying the name. On paper, Candle Cove was modest and tidy. Saying the name out loud feels like you're calling for something that listens. The second capture happened 3 nights after the first. I told myself I wouldn't go out again after dusk, that I'd wait for daylight and be sensible. But the ledger in my front pocket said otherwise. Somebody was always in need of fish, and the need keeps you honest in ways folks don't realize until their belly's full and their hands are not shaking. That evening the fog lay thick enough to cut with a knife. My lantern leaked a ring of yellow that the mist swallowed at the edges. I could hear the motor cough and settle into a rhythm like a sleeping thing, low and patient. The sea smelled of metal and something sour like old fruit. The line went taut quicker than I expected. My hands remembered the motions, the pull, the counter, the steady winding. When the creature broke surface, I understood why Simon had been busy at night. This thing floated like a lantern, a bad lantern, and left a slick in its wake like oil. It shuddered on the deck, and its glow dimmed, then flared again. A smell came up with it, faint at first, and then stronger. A smell like old pennies and wet earth. My stomach turned in a way I don't call nausea. It was a warning. "Where's this from?" Simon asked in the next morning, holding the creature up to his light. He didn't say a name. His hands were careful, practiced. He tested its skin with the tip of his finger and shook his head. "Near Candle Cove," I said. "Longline found it where the map shows the shoal." He paid me without asking if I'd seen anything else. He didn't want stories on his ledger, only items that moved and sold. "You stick to what's useful," Simon told me. "Glory doesn't feed anyone." Somewhere between that exchange and the kettle whistling in Julian's kitchen, I realized I'd become part of a circuit. Men like me pulled things from the deep. Simon boxed them up. Money changed hands, and strangers in coats. Buyers who came by skiff in the small hours, left again. No receipts, nothing that could be traced back to a town's council meeting or a charity ledger. They moved quietly and paid handsomely. And then there was the note, the scrap, the way Peter ducked his head when someone mentioned Candle Cove. The island had a way of corralling secrets like fish in a net, loose, thrashing, but contained enough to feed the town. People adjusted. They sold what the sea gave and walked the thin line between looking at what was happening and averting their gaze for the sake of habit. At nights, the fog would press against my windows like a curious guest, and I'd sit with the scrap of map and the little note and think on Rowan. Men like Rowan don't simply vanish, but people on Redstone learn to live with strange absences the way they learn to live with storms. Wrap up loose things, tie the boat to a cleat, and hope the tide's mercy holds. On a Friday, Julian slid a drink my way and spoke quieter than he had before. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said. "You don't have to be the sort to chase the thing that's bobbing at the end of your line." "I'm not chasing anything," I lied. "Lies are small things at first, and then you notice them stacked in the corner like old nets. I'm doing my job." "You always say that," Julian said. "We all say that. I slept poorly that night. Dreams are clumsy in fog. They smear details and make you unable to tell whether the sound you woke to was real or a remnant from sleep. I woke before dawn with the boat rocking gently and the map clutched in my hand like something fragile. Decision wears down into steps. First you say, no. Then you say, maybe. Then, without a man noticing, you are tying lines and checking the motor and filling the tank as if you've done nothing unusual at all. The debt in my pocket is a steady engine. You learn to plan your meals by it. The morning before I left, Charles came aboard my boat. He stood with a cup of coffee and a thermos that steamed while his hands were empty. His face was polite and a little tired. "You understand the terms," he said. "You take this job, you work it off. You don't take anything you can't carry, you don't bring trouble to town." "I won't," I said. "Men say what's convenient and pray the sea keeps its own counsel." Charles didn't smile at that. He looked into the water like he was considering the ledger of names written below the surface. "You'll watch the lights," he said finally. "You'll watch the line. You come back if anything's off. We don't want rumors reaching the mainland." His voice held the way of someone saying something important without spelling it out. I left the harbor with the map tucked in my jacket, the note from M taped back to the hull for safekeeping, and a head full of practical plans. I told myself I'd be careful, that I knew the sea better than to believe in sightless things, but candlelight at sea is a different beast from the hearth candle at home. It throws things into relief you don't see in the day. The approach to Candle Cove showed nothing in daylight. It was a cradle of rock and a small shoal that the tides liked to hide. The inlet looked harmless, wash of green between two darker points of shore. The locals' stories make daytime seem cruel, sweet and normal like bait. Why would the sea behave differently when the sun's on the face of it? But the island taught me new rules. What's ordinary by day can become something else when the moon keeps vigil. I pulled the lines taut, checked the knots, and watched the shoreline under the map's inked curve. The water here had a certain stillness that made it look like a plate of black glass. There was a patient breathing under the surface that didn't match the tide. My lantern flickered as the sun set. The engine coughed and found its rhythm. I should have felt steady. Instead, every snap of line and every creak of timber sounded like a counting of my sins. I wasn't sure then whether I was going because of work or because men like me are fragile creatures that must look under rocks. Curiosity and debt are close cousins. I hadn't gone far from the harbor when I saw the first bulbs. They were small at first, little floating things like pieces of glass caught in the water, each giving off a soft pulse the way a heart does. I thought they were jellyfish at first. I thought I'd misread lines on a map. But then they rearranged themselves, and that's when you realize you're witnessing something that isn't following the rules, you know. They blinked like an audience in a dark theater, and the sea answered with a hush that made every sound on my boat ampler. I slowed the motor. The night slipped around me like a cloak, and when I leaned forward, the bulbs were not jellyfish at all. They were eyes, small, many, and careful. They watched and they registered. Not like dumb things, but like things with the patience to wait for your next movement. My hands tightened on the wheel. The engine's cough was suddenly loud, a rude interruption. I remember thinking, irrationally, that there would be a moment when everything would explain itself. I also remember the way the bulb's light painted the waves in a color that might as well have been the inside of a bell. The water at the bow looked different, as if a living thing lay curled beneath it, sleeping and dreaming of tides. I pulled back, inching away from the cluster of lights. The bulbs didn't move. They stayed where they were, patient as tide markers. That's when I felt the first groan. Not the groan of a ship creaking in the cold, but something that came from below the surface and rolled up under the hull like a hand scraping along a throat. It vibrated through the planks and set my teeth on edge. For a second, I just listened. The bulbs blinked slower, like someone waiting for an answer. I had to decide. That night my decisions were all arithmetic. Keep going equals more money, more chance the debt will shrink. Pull back equals safety and the slow grind of scraping by at the market. You learn to weigh those things with a bitter sort of clarity. I made my choice then as men do. For something that felt reasonable at the moment and dreadful later, I cut loose a long line and let the hooks drop where the map claimed the shoal would be. What rose up on the line I did not recognize properly until I had it in the bucket and the lantern spilled its light over it. It pulsed, slow and sickly, the same green glow as before, only bigger. Muscles like bands under a skin that was too thin and kept leaking that tar-black film that sank into the bucket. From an opening near its middle, something shone like a small coal, a heart light that kept the creature alive. When I brought it aboard, it made no sound but gave off a wet, metallic smell. I burned that image into my head because that's the way men remember. You mark a detail and anchor the rest to it. The creature looked almost like a squid until you allowed more time to look. It had plates, small ridges, like a spine running along its belly, and where an eye should have been, there was a little bulb of green. By the time I motored back, the fog had thickened into drapery. The lights of the town were smeared like reflections in a glass that had been breathed upon. On the hull, the little note from M cracked in the cold. I had a bagging sense of wrongness, the kind you get when you've opened something you shouldn't have. At the landing, heard Julian before I saw him. His step, quick, concerned. Simon was already there, looking at the crate like a man waiting to confirm a rumor. "You did well," Simon said, and the words came out like someone counting money. "You did dangerous well." I wanted to argue, to tell them about the way the water had watched me, about the groan that came from under the hull. Instead, I set the creature down, watched it pulse, and let men do what they do, make use of what the sea gives them. Men here have an economy out of mysteries. They barter with things most places would burn. That night I slept with a radio, though it was useless more often than not. Radios don't pick up much in Redstone. They catch static and the sound of a distant storm. The island keeps its own air. I lay awake, thinking about Rowan and the book and the way the fog sat like a lid on the water. I thought about the note that said not to fish here after dark and how that was advice I'd gone and ignored. In the morning, Julian poured coffee and watched me as a man watches a clock he's considering breaking. "You ever consider not taking the money?" he asked. I looked at him. The ledger in my head kept ticking. It's simple math. Money or no money. "What's the point of having hands if you don't use them?" I said. Julian didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. "There are things at Candle Cove that cost more than bills can measure. They cost the quiet. They cost the names of men you once knew. Names are more than letters to people like us. We keep them in a safe place. When names go missing, the ledger gets strange. The town moved around me in ways I did not like. People split their gazes and pretended their routine was unchanged. But the fact was undeniable. Candle Cove had teeth, and the job offer had put me close enough to feel them. I had the map piece folded in my jacket, and the note from M still taped to the hull like a small admonition. I had money in my pocket in a sense that I'd already stepped over a line. People told stories of the cove as if telling them was a way to dilute them. Julian told one about the day a line of strange fish rolled onto the shore like a carpet and the whole town came to see. Men in coats came, they bought, and the town learned. They learned that the sea had things to sell that were not like other things. They learned which questions cost you rest. That afternoon, Charles stopped by the dock again. He didn't come aboard this time. He stepped to the pier and watched the water. "We need men who are steady," he said finally. "We like you, George. You're practical. Don't make us regret it." I said nothing. What do you tell a mayor when he's telling you something that's half aid and half warning? You nod, you promise. You take the money, you keep the maps snug in your jacket, and you listen for groans in the night. When I pulled the boat out that evening, the lanes were already thick with those little lights. They made a corridor of eyes, patrolling and patient. The bulbs didn't move like a shoal. They arranged like stakes along a fence. It was as if the cove had a perimeter that showed itself only at night, a ring of awareness, the way a moat defends a castle. The air felt like the moment before a bell is rung, taut and expectant. My hands worked on reflex. Check the line, tighten the knot, glance at the horizon. The map's ink was pressed against my chest like a hot coal. I think then, foolishly, I believed there was a point where we might see the cove for what it was, and understand it well enough to keep ourselves away from it. That was vanity, plain and simple. I had no idea then how much the sea would teach me about not knowing. The map had given me a route, the note had given me a warning, and the job had given me a reason. None of those things gave me the right kind of knowledge. They gave me facts and left out the cost. There was a sound from below as I passed the shoal this time. Not a groan, but a scraping, a long, slow rasp like a spine moving through a sleeve. The bulbs blinked more rapidly as if excited. I felt the boat drop like someone had taken a hand and pressed it down against the water. That's where I'm stopping for now, with the boat leaning into the dark and the air full of a dozen little eyes. I had the map, the note, and the calculation that a man's debts don't forgive themselves. I had a choice that night, and like most choices in this line of work, it felt like choosing between two kinds of wrong. I won't tell you yet what I saw when the water decided to answer back. I'll only say this. If you come to Redstone, if you're handed a job offer that mentions Candle Cove and promises money, think on the note someone left on my hull. Don't fish here after dark. M. It's not a superstition. It's a first line of defense. There's a difference between knowing the sea and knowing what hides in the places the map doesn't mark. I learned that in a way I can't unlearn. The rest of it, the reason men buy what the sea spits up, the ledger people keep, the way the fog holds its breath, unfolds from that night like a net pulling up more than you bargained for. The boat dropped like a man who's had the wind knocked out of him. For a heartbeat, everything was wrong. The lantern tore a hole in the fog and the bulbs shivered like a cluster of small suns. The hull rolled and I heard the long rasp again, a sound like a comb run down a bone. It wasn't a thing you can pretend at. No creak of timber, no freighted swell that a man can brace against. It was something deliberate, an articulation of weight sliding under the skin of the water. I reached for the wheel and found my hands shaking. The long line was paying out in a slow, flailing way I didn't recognize. Hooks slapped the deck and one of them caught my sleeve. I cursed and freed myself. The lantern swung and painted the surface in slashes. The bulbs around the shoal blinked as if in conversation. For a moment I thought I could see a curve, the suggestion of a back, moving like a slow tide beneath them. Then the water broke. It rose in a low, wet ridge that followed the line of the cove, each crest like a vertebra, slick with a skin that caught the lantern and threw it back in sickly green. The ridge wasn't smooth. It had the narrow, knotted texture of old rope. Only that rope was living, and between the coils, little bulbs winked and pulsed. When the ridge cleared the water enough to show itself in the lantern light, it made the world cheap and small, like a child's toy pulled from shadow. I say it, like I can pin that to a single thing. The truth is stranger. The ridge was part of something that wore its tendencies like a geology, an expanse that might have been back or belly, a seam of plates rising and falling with the water. From between those plates came a sound that moved through the planks and into my teeth, a low groan that could have been a throat clearing or the sea shifting its bones. It was old sounding, like something that remembered when the coast was different. The bulbs nearest me blinked brighter, then drew focus on a group of three that hovered like watchmen. Each was an eye when it opened, an aperture that looked from where we stood with the unsettling patience of a thing that understands counting. They weren't simple reflectors. They saw, I could see the shine of myself in them, the lantern, the wheel, the brief white of my knuckles. For a second it felt like being inspected in a customs office by an official with no face. My first unpracticed thought, ridiculous and immediate, was how to make the motor louder. Sound, it seems, remains the oldest bargaining chip with things that keep measure. I jabbed the throttle. The motor coughed, and the sound took shape, ugly and human. The ridge answered with a deeper tone, a rumble that harmonized with the engine and made the lantern shiver. The bulbs along the ridge clustered, some sinking and some bobbing, as if the being beneath had decided whether to reveal more. Then, as if stirred, the ridge arched. It wasn't a dramatic surge, it was an economy of movement. Ribs, if you want the word, unspooled in segments, each reflective with that same internal green. Between the segments blackened, mucus dripped, a slow shedding that slid off in ribbons and feathered the surface with the smell of old copper and the flat sharpness of pennies. The scent clawed at a memory of wet coins in a drainpipe. At that point the long line stilled. I don't think the thing grabbed it. I think it considered it and let the line be. But my deck was slick, and the creature's presence had turned the lights already on my face a color I didn't like. Adrenaline tightened me into instructions. Cut the line, run for the channel, get away. Before whatever lay further in had the patience to test me. I reached for the winch and felt the deck tilt. A swell the like of which I've seen in storms pitched the stern under and the bow up like a hand lifting. The ridge moved nearer, a spine making itself a wake that sloshed across the gunwale. For a moment we were eye to eye, and that's no mannerism. There was an eye the size of a small porthole half coiled in a groove where a vertebra might meet skin. It watched me with a slitted patience, unblinking. In that instant, it felt as if it could read the number of stitches on my hands, count the days I had left, know the sum in my pocket without a ledger. I didn't think noble thoughts. I thought the same thought men on little boats near cattle think. You're going to lose the boat if you don't act. I yanked the winch, a jerky damned motion, and the hooks slipped free. Line slapped the deck, and at once I was taking in slack, ripping it over the drum, my arms burning with the effort. The lantern swung and nearly went. The hull shook like a man with a fever. The eye, if that is the right word, tracked my movement. It tightened like a pupil might. The ridge rolled, and for a moment the sea seemed to lift a shoulder as if to get a look at me proper. That's when something else surfaced aft, a swelling that rose 3, maybe 4 feet out of the water and edged along the stern like a spine seeking purchase. I'd rather not call it a mouth, because images settle wrong. It was an aperture of sorts, an opening that revealed wet folds and, in the little light, a blackness that didn't scatter any reflection. You felt it in your molars. You felt the suggestion of a hunger beneath the surface, polite until it was not. I threw the engine into a surge, and the motor answered, coughing and then finding a coarse rhythm. The bow dipped down into a wave, and for half a second the ridge and I were level. My world contracted to the size of my wheel and the count of the pulses of those bulbs. You do not rehearse courage. You find it when the only alternative is to be counted among what the tide takes. I put the helm down and went for speed, for the channel, for anything with a name. The bulbs blinked in a slow cascade behind me, like the closing of lidded eyes. The ridge followed, patient as tide, making a wake that thrashed my hull and aimed my stern into the shallow places where rocks might have the courtesy to stick a keel. Every second it was closer. There are little mercies in things like this. One is that motors still like fuel, and the second is that fog is not a thing that can find anchors. The engine bit, the prop caught, and for all the green light and groaning and the living spine moving like a thing that kept time by its own pulses, I had more speed than the ridge could manage in that moment. I shoved the wheel and felt the boat run like a dog that's been called. The ridge made one last arch, and then, as if closing a page, settled and slid back into the water with a noise like a dozen doors shutting at once. When the lights of the town came up, smeared and trembling through the fog, I felt the first tremor of exhaustion that is not only of body. My chest heaved and a salt, sour taste hung at the back of my tongue. I'd left behind hooks, a lamp, a crate smeared with that black film. I'd also left behind curiosity, which is harder to count and costs more. I tied off at the pier with hands that wouldn't steady, and men came running, not with mercy, at least, but with the urgency of people who want to know whether they can keep what they need. Julian was at the landing, pale in his skin, looking like a man who'd been reading by candlelight too long. He always had that look, like somebody was holding a note under his nose, and he was deciding whether to read it aloud. "You got back," he said. No praise, no relief, just a statement. I didn't want to tell it as it had been. The spine, the eye like a port, the way the bulbs arrange themselves like a fence. Words flatten what you've seen. I told the small truths. The line went taut, there was light from the catch, the long line came in with hooks, and one of them snagged into a slick I hadn't booked for. I left out the eye at first, because it made people tilt their heads. You learn how much of the world your neighbors can bear. Simon stood with his coat open, hands blackened, his ledger tight in one fist. He looked at the creature I'd left in the crate and then at me, like a man weighing a debt. "You got trouble," he said simply. "You met trouble and you brought one of its things home," Julian replied, and the baritone of his voice carried a warning all the same. People near trouble act in one of two ways. They pretend it's a ledger entry, or they work out how to make it feed them. Here in Redstone, we did both. We split the money under the worst sort of civility. Simon counted and folded and left me with the brown paper and the notional warmth of knowing I'd pushed another month ahead. I kept the scrap of map in my jacket and the note from M under my bedpost where it made a hollow in the wood. That night, I could not sleep. Fatigue catches the body, but the mind runs a different ledger. It tallies what it must keep in memory against what must be forgotten. I found myself thinking about the ridge and the eye that had watched me, as if measuring me against something like a contract. I thought absurdly about Rowan and how men who look too long at a thing begin to think they own some part of it, and then the thing begins to owe them back in terrible ways. In the morning there was a scratch at my hull. It was subtle, a faint scoring across paint like a child's restless finger drawing patterns on a window. Peter, the dockmaster, saw it first and said nothing immediate. He ran a hand along the line as if feeling for a knot he'd lost. "You shouldn't keep your note on the hull," he told me quietly when he thought I wasn't looking. "Things look for what they know." "Is that a warning or a proverb?" I asked, rubbing my thumb along the groove. He looked at me with the kind of weariness you only see in men who have this town's ledger in their heads. "Both," he said. Then he walked off, as if nothing more needed saying. Rumor is a lazy animal. It curls up in corners and sleeps until someone trips over it. By noon, people were asking about my trip like it was a market report. Julian kept his face gentle and did the sort of listening that doesn't ask questions, but stores them. Charles stopped by the pier with a face that had rain in it. He didn't ask how close I'd been. He told me we'd need men for the next run and watched my hands like a judge watches a defendant. "You saw something," he told me. "Mind you keep it in mind." His precise vagueness worked like a needle. I read it as a nudge and a lever both. Men like Charles do not want fuss. They want quiet accounting. They want the cove to give and take without the rest of the world looking too closely. He left me his civility like a coin. That afternoon I did something I'd known I would do and fought with the idea of admitting I'd wanted to do it. I went to Rowan's house. Rowan's place sits back from the lane, on a slope where the ground gives way to sea in a way that seems indecorous. It was a tidy house once, with curtains and a porch, and when Rowan took to talking to the fog, the curtains closed and the porch chairs emptied. The garden had gone to seed, a kettle lay rusted at the edge of a path. The door was still shut. I knocked and heard nothing. The latch gave. The house was like a mouth with no appetite, rooms where a hand had left a cup, an armchair with a newspaper in it, a pocket on the chair's side where Rowan used to tuck his little book. There were signs of a hurry, not a panic. So many things left as if an errand had been interrupted, but nothing so neat as packing. I felt like a voyeur. I also felt like somebody who'd come to claim a ledger entry. The book was gone. That was the thing that hit me like a missing tooth. You reconstruct people out of objects. When an object is missing, you try to find where it went and what went with it. What I did find were papers, scraps of writing and maps, and a single charcoal sketch of the cove. Rowan's handwriting was small and worked like tight stitches. The sketch had that little ink smile where the cove's dot should be. On the inside flap, someone had scrawled in a heavy hand, "They mark us." There were ash stains on the hearth and a smell of something that had been burned cleanly, like a paper set to flame rather than a thing that succumbed to accident. A single page lay singed but legible, lines of words in a tight, urgent script, interspersed with symbols that looked like the bulbs in the cove and a repeated series of marks that might have been a count. The words were not neat theology or the kind of fevered rant you expect from a man losing his mind. They were notes, like a man trying to learn a language he didn't know he had. Something else lay under the cot. A small tin with a folded note, and beneath it, a coin I'd seen before. A small flat disc stamped with a fish and a stranger's initials. On the back of the note was only one line. "Annum, do not answer the lights." I slid the note into my pocket and felt the old rust of his fear travel up my arm. There was a smell to Rowan's house that I can't name. It was almost the scent of old maps, paper held too close to the heat, and also the faint chemical tang of preservation. Rowan had been trying to keep things safe, or at least catalogued. He made lists. He drew shapes. He counted bulbs. That kind of obsession makes you part of a ledger of its own. I took nothing but the singed page and the note. Burglary for curiosity is a poor virtue. The world is lit by a small law. You take and you leave what you must. I left Rowan's house with a mouthful of questions and a map in my jacket that already felt too heavy. When I brought the singed pages to Julian, his hands trembled and he swore under his breath. He read the page once, twice, then folded it up and tucked it away like a relic. He didn't offer it to me to look through again. "You should have left well enough alone," he said finally. "Or else you should have taken the left." "What's the left?" I asked. He told me softly about a place where men like Rowan used to go when they wanted to be alone with their least comfortable thoughts. It wasn't a place on any map. It was a way of being. Julian warned me again, in that soft voice, that curiosity has a price and that sometimes the ledger isn't in money. "What if the ledger is supposed to be paid?" I asked. "What if someone's been borrowing against us?" He looked down at his hands. "Then you are the sort to find out and the sort to lose everything for it." I felt the weight of my choices then as if they were sums written in black ink on my palm. The town, I realized, had arranged itself around a compromise. We took the sea's gifts and pretended nothing else was happening. The buyers in dark coats came, they paid, and they left. People like Rowan wanted to see what had been traded and how the contract read. Most people prefer clean ledgers. The next run was scheduled in 2 nights. I had a decision to make, and I knew, before any gods or ledgers could weigh in, that I was prone to making the wrong one. The map in my pocket had the cove's smile stamped soft into its crease. The note from M lay under the mattress, and sometimes, in the stillness, my hand brushed it, and I felt the outline of the ink. On the second night, I loaded the long lines with a different kind of fever. I wrapped the hooks and made sure the drum turned smooth. The motor coughed, but found its note. I kept one lantern only and rigged it so the light would not prove a beacon. The fog had the courtesy to hold itself like a curtain. As I made my way back to the shoal, the bulbs were waiting, patient as ever. This time, I kept the boat low, let the engine whisper, and checked the map like a man uses a talisman. The break of the ridge came when I was unready. It rose slow and folded along the water like a low hill, the spine showing small nodules rhythmically lit. The sea was the same general gray as before, but there had been rain earlier, and the air smelled of iron and crushed herbs. I set the long line, and when the hooks went home, I felt a tug that was not a proper fish mind, but rather like a curiosity pulling at the hem of the world. I wound the drum in a cautious, almost reverent fashion. The thing I hauled in this time was not like the others. Its body was elongated, and the plates along its flank were more pronounced, like scales fused into a length of armor. When I leaned over to examine it, a shape beside the plates moved and revealed something that chilled my hands. A small ring of bulbs circling what might have been an orifice. They looked like eyes, but clustered, many in a ring, focusing in a manner I couldn't stomach. I slid the creature into the crate and covered it out of reflex. That motion felt like a pact. The crate was heavier than it should have been. I lashed it and wondered who I was really keeping company with. Back at the landing, the buyer was waiting. He came in a skiff that rode low, black as if carved from coal, and he had a coat that wouldn't have looked out of place at a man's funeral in the city. He never took off his hat. He had a way of not introducing himself that makes you feel unimportant until he wants you to feel important. He inspected the crate with hands that had been trained to look for value. He did not ask me how the catch had been performed. He assumed I'd done what men do, made a bargain. "How many do you have?" he asked, voice a dry thing. "2 special ones," I said. "A couple more regulars." He smiled a smile that had been seen at too many ledgers. "You ever curious about where they come from?" His question had the practice of a man learning an accent. He wanted an answer, but not a full one. "Near Candle Cove," I said. It was as plain as it could be without becoming a confession. He nodded. "Good. We prefer them untroubled." He reached in and took a small object from the crate, one of the bulbs perhaps, and turned it in his gloved hand. It pulsed faintly like a dying watch. "You see, Mr. Calder," he said, not using my first name like he had no claim to it, "men who bring us value are rewarded." "How much?" I asked. He named a number that would stitch the debt in half and send a good season ahead. His coin felt heavy and wrong, like medicine that numbs the taste before it heals. "You'll be careful," he added. "We like quiet people. There's a kind of silence that is purchased. You take it, fold it into your coat pocket, and it stays. Men leave it at the docks and take their steps home." When he left, Julian watched him go with a look that was equal parts disgust and understanding. That's what the town did. It put on its best indifference in order to keep the economy of the odd and the necessary working. I sold him both crates. The brown paper bill in my coat left me with the stink of coin ringing in my nose. Money redesigns conversation. People who owe less speak differently. I could feel the ledger shift a little in my favor. I could feel my hands become useful again. Yet usefulness is a poor substitute for sleep. I'd spend nights thinking of that eye, the spine, the slow light of the bulbs. I kept recurring to a question I could not answer. Were those eyes a watching intelligence, or merely the natural device of a biology living in an alien geography? The town's economy preferred the second answer, since the second bought less guilt. Rowan, now a name like a stone, had probably asked the first and then paid for it. Time makes its own kind of smoothing. Weeks pass, and the ledger balances, and in that time, your mind gets used to accounting for terror the way it accounts for weather. You learn to check knots, to fish in the day's pale light when you can, and to avoid long lines at night unless you need to. But money has a way of revoicing options, unless you're content to eat sardines and tell yourself you're noble for it. There came a night a month later when a storm was promised, one of those slow depressions that drags fog and wind with it and leaves behind a smell like a wet book. I was ashore that evening, mending nets by Julian's light, thinking of the map and Rowan's burnt pages, when Peter found me by the cleat and handed me something folded in oilcloth. "It's been slid under the dock," he said, "not meant for public hands." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Inside the oilcloth was another scrap of chart, a small circular drawing with a ring of marks, and in the center a tiny sketch of something that might have been a spine. Along the edge of the ink he'd scrawled a single word, M, and beneath it a line in a different hand. 2 more men. You're in. My stomach fell in on itself. It was as if someone had written the final tally and then handed the receipt to me. I folded the paper and hid it in my jacket, feeling suddenly like a ledger with a new debit. I went to sleep that night with a thought like a stone in my chest. The town moves in patterns. We sell what the sea gives and pretend it's business. But there are times when business becomes something else. Contracts are made in the quiet hours by men who wear coats and understand how to make want polite. Rowan, perhaps, had gotten into the wrong kind of ledger with the wrong kind of buyer. Or perhaps he had tried to see the book in full and been taken by it. I cannot say which is worse. The morning after the oilcloth scrap appeared, the radio at the landing crackled like an old prayer. The sound came loud and then fell silent. No one caught any useful voice from the mainland. It was as if the island had decided to keep its air. That evening Charles called me to the pier again, and when he smiled this time there was no civility to it. "We've had offers," he said, and the words were chosen to be neither assurance nor threat. Good men from outside asking for steady supply. People don't always wash up clean. Sometimes you need someone who knows the shoal. "I know the shoal," I said. That was both true and insufficient. "You'll be careful." He looked at me with the same measured politeness and offered me a contract in the form of work details and a promise of pay. "We'll rotate crews. We won't burn the town to keep the lights on." His phrasing was a slow rope. I could see the logic. The town needed money, and the cove supplied strange things the mainland paid for. The mayor's ledger was not only about votes, it was about keeping roofs over heads. Men like Charles do a certain arithmetic, the sum of a town's shame against the sum of its survival. I took the job. That's the point where a man can make whatever peace he needs to live with himself. I told myself it would be the last night run. That's how we tell ourselves we are good men, in the way we schedule guilt. The run that night was the quietest I'd had. The fog hung low, and the bulbs were like scattered teeth. There were other boats out, a small fleet, each with a lantern turned low as though to be courteous. The buyers were more frequent now. The coatmen came from places I'd never bother to name, and they worked in an economy that kept its accounts where men in suits don't have to look strangers in the eye. As we set our lines, the water was not as patient as before. The ridge rose with more speed, and the bulbs arranged into a ring farther out, enclosing an area like a deliberative chamber. The crackle through the radio that night was odd. No words, only a frequency that made the hair on my arms set like small antennas. It was useless, and yet suitable to the mood. When the line pulled, there was a different resistance. The thing we hauled was large, and the hooks came up with a heavy weight that made the drum whine. I wound it slow, careful. As the creature cleared the surface, I felt a pressure in my chest that was not fear, but the sense of a scale tipping. This one was not a single specimen. It was a clump, almost a bouquet, of smaller bodies, fused in a way I didn't have a neat name for. Where they joined, the skin had a pattern like lace, and the bulbs at their junctions winked with a steady green. I felt hands on the rail then. Other crew, men who had signed the same agreement as me, and for a second I was reassured by company. But the crowding made us careless. One man leaned to get a better look, and the bulb nearest him opened like an eyelid and focused. It wasn't just a shimmer of light. It was the attention of something that felt. He froze, eyes wide, and then he turned and vomited over the side in a way that marked him as having seen more than his ledger allowed. The buyer's skiff arrived with its gentleman and 2 quiet men who took the crate without looking at me. The gentleman counted and hushed. He was pleased and made a small remark about the quality and the rarity. He left money that made a man's pockets heavy in the way stone makes a bag heavy. We drifted away from the shoal with a weight in our boxes and a thing in our heads that we had purchased. The bulbs along the ridge blinked as if to say goodbye. The ridge rolled and the spine folded back under its skin like a seam closing. For a moment, as we pulled up anchor and ran for deeper water, I thought the worst was over. That's when I heard it. The sound of a bell struck beneath water, a long, low calling. It rolled through the hull and into the marrow of a man and made him feel like a child again. Small, and not as brave as he thought. The bulbs around us brightened and then dimmed like breaths. The storm hit in a way that felt deliberate. Not a natural storm, but a weather that arrived because some pressure had been altered. The fog thickened, reared up, and the wind caught the lanterns and turned them into halos that didn't light the way but merely made the night visible. Waves rose, and we were in a game of small boats in a sea that had decided to grieve. The ridge reared again, and this time came closer. Closer than it had any right to be. Our motor sputtered. The prop caught weeds in a slick that smelled metallic. The bulb ring ahead brightened, and I saw beyond the ring the suggestion of another mount, taller than the ridge. A thing whose back broke the surface like a cathedral arch. It was not all expanse. It had character, a central boss that rolled with the tide. If the ridge was a spine, this was an axis. I had the feeling of being at the rim of a thought I could not finish. Future and past folded into a single ledger page, and I had no ink. There is bravery in small boat crew, but there is also a quick recognition of incompetence when competence is required. The man next to me shouted in a language I'd heard all my life, tireless, old sailors' cuss words. He grabbed the net and flung it over the side like a ward. The net wrapped and snagged somewhere under the water, trailing with a weight that pitched our bow down. Something seized the net. For a moment it felt like a hand, and then it was a pressure, like the pull of a tide, only backwards. The motor groaned and the boat slammed as if the sea pushed it away. We were scuttled between curiosity and awe. I felt a spray, salt, black slick, lash my face and taste like pennies. The man at the tiller hollered for full throttle, for turn, for anything that would unstick us. January, an older fellow with a face like a map, took a look at the ridge and swore, and then did a thing I would remember later. He took a flare and flung it toward the bulbs. Fire is a language you can write in, and it sometimes changes the conversation. The flare ignited in hot white and arced. The bulbs nearest it pulsed and then shrank away, like a child withdrawing a hand from heat. The central axis reared and let out a deeper groan, like a bell being struck by water. For a second, it felt like a communion of voices, and we were excluded. We cut lines and ran. The sea seemed to lean with us. Behind us, the bulbs blinked and sorted themselves into ranks. The central axis sank slowly, as if deliberate, and then flicked in a motion that wet the stern of my boat and left a residue that steamed in the cold air. We ran and kept running until the lights of the harbor were the only sane things in the night. In the aftermath, there was damage to gear and a bruise to the confidence of men who'd possibly signed something with their backs. Men that night spoke softly about things which before had been ledger entries to be balanced. Rowan's name came up and then fell away. Men made small jokes so that laughter could be used to cover the small cracks. I went home and sat on the back step and thought about the map and the notes and the single line that ran like a vein through everything I'd done. Money? Money greases the joints and keeps the town from squeaking into ruin. It also paints you a target and designs a contract out of what you do not always understand. A week later, a small boat burned up by the rocks on the far side of Little Red. People said it was bad maintenance. Older men said it was the sea taking what it was owed. I thought of the buyer's hands and the gentlemen who never took off their hats, and I thought of Rowan's book. Coin has a way of smoothing edges. The final act for me was not a swell or a monster. It was a slow, personal settling. I sold what I had to and kept what I could hide. I began to mend my nets by day and to sleep beside a kettle by night. I avoided the night runs for a spell, and then, like any man who learns to live with fear, I bent it until it fit. I found myself less hungry for the cove's light, less eager to see the ridge rise. Curiosity is a cheap trait to possess, until it costs something you can't afford. Months later, someone left a note on my hull again. Not the neat hand of M, but a pressed scrap of paper. A single line, written in a hurried hand, taped to the planking where the old note had been. It read, "They take what understands." I folded it carefully and left it under the mattress. Messages like that are small comforts in their own way. They confirm that you are not the only one who's noticed. Time moved in ways both comforting and cruel. The town's economy shifted like a bone settling under flesh. The buyers continued to come and go. People learned the odd rhythms of living on a ledger that tried to account for the unaccountable. Rowan remained a missing line in that ledger, a hole stamped in the schedule of Sunday chores and warded off with quiet mentions. The red and silver book never reappeared as a thing you could carry. It became a rumor header, like a storm, something men consulted and then decided it was best to leave alone. I keep the scrap of map folded in my jacket. Sometimes, when I pass it, the ink seems to look up at me. It sits like a small mammal in your pocket, a living thing whose presence you accept because you are too weary to be brave. If you come to Redstone, or find yourself listening to a man who's been to Candle Cove, hear me plain. The sea is not all ledger and level. It has edges that come down into your life and force you to choose. You can be practical, as I was, and feed your family with what you bring in. You can be curious, as Rowan must have been, and pry until you find a book you don't understand. Or you can avoid the cove at night and be a poor man with a clear name. Each choice has a cost. I keep my head down now. I watch for bulbs in the water and for men in dark coats. I keep the map under lock when I'm ashore and out of sight when I'm not. I sleep with a light on and a chart book under the bed, and I avoid long lines at night if I can. If I am offered another job that says Candle Cove on the invoice, I refuse outright, and then I watch myself for 3 days to see if I have lied. People asked me once whether I'd go back. The answer is messy and human. I might, because debt is a constant engine. But the truth is, I have the map folded, and the memory of an eye like a porthole burned so deep that I wake with the image in the dark. I can't unsee it. There are nights I feel the sea breathe under the skin of the harbor, and I relive the groan like an old song. Months after Rowan vanished, a boy told me he'd seen someone at the edge of the cove holding a red book. The boy's eyes were wide, and the salt on his lips tasted of fear rather than fish. People nodded and shut the business of the day's work. It's better that way. The town keeps its wind and it's quiet, and men go on. The ledger stays in black. If you ever get an offer, if a man in a polite coat tells you he'll clear your debt for a single night of work and the place he names is Candle Cove, remember the scrap of paper someone once taped to my hull. Don't fish here after dark. M. It is not superstition. It is a line drawn where one man could not be trusted to be your guardian. And one last thing, because I do these things honestly, if you want to hear more stories like this, if the sort of tales that leave you with a taste of iron and the image of eyes bobbing at the mooring interest you, leave a word below. Tell me you were near a cove once, or that you too found a map with a missing corner. Subscribe if you want more first-person trouble from places men prefer not to name. People love a ledger with suspense on the side. As for Candle Cove, the ridge sleeps sometimes and wakes other times. The bulbs still make their slow circuits, and the sea keeps its balance between what it gives and what it takes. I keep my hands on my nets, my head down, and my scrap of map folded where my heart would be if I allowed it to be soft. If curiosity ever feels like a coin in your pocket, think on whether the purchase is worth the debt. The sea taught me that maps lie by omission more often than by intention. The missing pieces are not accidents, they are choices. And sometimes the cost of learning what's been hidden is higher than any payout a buyer can give you.